Right now, countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are facing an AIDS catastrophe. According to the World Health Organization, in 2018, 1.1 million Africans were newly infected with HIV, and 25.7 million were living with HIV. There's some good news, though. Between 2000 and 2018, new HIV infections fell by 37%. Now, many corporations have unique human catastrophe rescue competencies with respect to the AIDS catastrophe, and we're going to call those UHCRC firms for short. Nobody's going to deny that UHCRC firms that help out are doing something nice. Of course they are. But Thomas Dunfee asks us to go a little bit further. He asks us to consider whether UHCRC firms have a moral obligation to help in the AIDS catastrophe. This is to say, would it be morally wrong for a UHCRC firm to not help? So before we can answer this question, let's go a little bit deeper about what catastrophes are and what UHCRC firms are. So Dunfee writes that any event that satisfies the following three conditions is a grave human catastrophe. This is to say, the following conditions are jointly sufficient conditions for something's being a grave human catastrophe. So condition A, the harms must involve severe physical injury, deprivation, or death. B, hundreds of thousands of humans must be affected. And C, the harms must be immediate rather than projected. So a lot of catastrophes are not going to satisfy these three conditions, but obviously the AIDS crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa definitely and decidedly does. So we also introduced the term UHCRC. So Dunfee offers some conditions for that as well. In this case, the conditions are necessary and sufficient conditions. So what that means is that all firms that satisfy these conditions are UHCRC firms, but it means something else. It means that only firms that satisfy these conditions are UHCRC firms. So if you satisfy it, you count as a UHCRC firm. If you don't satisfy it, then you don't count as a UHCRC firm. So let's take a look at it. The first criterion for being a UHCRC firm is that the core competency of the firm must enable it to mitigate or alleviate the source or cause of the catastrophe, or enable it to respond to the devastation caused by the catastrophe. So what this means for our purposes is that a company like Coca-Cola doesn't count as a UHCRC firm with respect to the AIDS catastrophe. Their core competencies do enable it to alleviate my thirst, but not somebody's risk of dying of AIDS. So let's A. B is as follows. The firm must have the capability to act to mitigate or alleviate the catastrophe. So what this means for our purposes is that the firm must actually be able to do something to help. So for example, it's politically impossible for U.S. pharmaceutical companies to go to North Korea right now. So for that reason, a company like Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson or Eli Lilly, they're not going to be UHCRCs with respect to catastrophes that happen in North Korea. C, the firm must have a comparative advantage in its ability to respond so that no other firm or entity can be identified that would be more effective in responding. So what this means for our purposes is that to count as a UHCRC, it can't be the case that another firm has a greater competency to help. But if you have the same level of competency as this other firm, then you can still be in a UHCRC if the other conditions are met. So let's go back to the question I posed a few minutes ago. Do UHCRCs have a moral obligation to help in grave human catastrophes like the AIDS catastrophe in Sub-Saharan Africa? So Dunfee's answer to this question is yes, and to make his case, he offers the following thought experiment. 6th graders visit a honey farm as part of a class outing. A twister strikes the farm, breaking the hives, and causing an angry swarm of bees to sting many of the children. Adult bystanders observe the mass stingings and quickly identify 5 children with life-threatening allergic reactions. A police officer and the farm's manager attempt to treat the distressed children, but they do not have any special knowledge about bee sting reactions, and their interventions are not effective. All 5 children die. Subsequently, it is revealed that one of the adult observers was a doctor specializing in allergic reactions who had medicine and equipment with her that might have enabled at least 1 or 2 of the children to survive. When questioned, The doctor explains that she did not intervene because of 4 reasons. First one was that the medicine in her bag was very valuable and belonged to the owners of the practice group with which she was associated. This is a property rights argument. Second excuse was that it's not her proper role to take action because the police officer was the public official in charge, and if the police officer knew that they did not have special knowledge, they should have surveyed the group to determine relevant expertise and then determine how resources should be allocated. So this is a role-based excuse. 3, she had committed to teaching a group of disadvantaged children how to play the flute after the honey farm tour, and had she intervened, she would not have been able to live up to that commitment. So this is an argument based on a prior commitment. Finally, last excuse she gives is that as a doctor, she knew that it was impossible to save all 5 children, but she did not consider herself an appropriate person to make triage judgments in these circumstances. So it's an argument based on a lack of competency. Now, clearly the doctor could have saved the lives of 1 or 2 of the children, but she didn't. Did she do something morally wrong? Do her excuses based on property rights, role responsibilities, prior commitments, and complacency succeed in shielding her from moral blame? So Dunfee's intuition, and most likely yours as well, is that the doctor did something wrong, and that her arguments are no more than unsuccessful excuses for immoral behavior. She had a moral obligation to rescue children. Dunfee notes that these 4 excuses are commonly offered in defense of companies trying to avoid their duty to help solve grave human catastrophes. Since, as we have seen in the case of the doctor, these excuses are insufficient to overcome a duty to rescue others in general, they're insufficient to undermine a duty of rescue in the case of UHCRC firms. And there's lots of reason to think that firms would have such a duty, regardless of whether we appeal to Scanlon's rescue principle, ideals of corporate and business citizenship, a framework of robust positive rights, or self-imposed promises made by pharmaceutical companies to fight deadly diseases. It's not difficult to justify such a duty to offer aid. And if you want a fuller picture of what all these different approaches would look like, take a look at Dunfee's paper, which I have linked in the description. So it's all well and good to say that UHCRC firms have an obligation to offer aid. One question remains, and that's how much aid do they have an obligation to offer? And here's what his answer is. Firms possessing a unique human catastrophe rescue competency have a moral obligation to devote substantial resources toward best efforts to aid the victims of the catastrophe. Unless financial exigency justifies a lower level of investment, they should devote at a minimum the largest sum of 1, their most recent year's investment in social initiatives, 2, their 5-year average of investment in social initiatives, 3, their industry's average investment in social initiatives, or 4, the average investment in social initiatives by firms in their home nation. They may devote a portion of those resources to concurrent social initiatives only if there is an equally compelling rationale for such an investment. So we're going to call this the Statement of Minimal Moral Obligation, or SMMO. So notice that the SMMO is quite limited in its demands. It only applies to companies who meet the stringent standards for being a UHCRC firm. If they're facing a dire financial emergency, this obligation will not stand in the way of their choice to focus their efforts on their financial health. The amount they're obligated to donate is based on the amount that they or relevantly similar companies are already donating. And the SMMO is a moral obligation, not a law. What's at issue is not whether companies should be compelled to follow the SMMO, but whether companies should follow it. So I want to conclude this presentation by discussing some objections to the SMMO. And what I want to talk about in particular are strategies for forming objections. So one strategy for coming up with objections to any criterion is to argue that it's either too stringent or too permissive. When you're arguing that a moral criterion is too stringent, you're arguing that it bans too much or sets too high a standard for behavior. On the other hand, when you argue that a moral criterion is too permissive, you're arguing that it allows too much or sets too low a standard for behavior. For example, one could argue that the SMMO is too stringent by exploring whether it exacts too high a price on pharmaceutical companies. In response, a defender of the SMMO could reply that companies facing financial exigency are not obligated to give aid under the SMMO, and that therefore the SMMO is not too stringent after all. On the other hand, one could argue that the SMMO is too permissive by saying that it places very few demands on companies and industries and countries that generally do not donate to charities. Dunfee's response here is that we ought to trust industry standards for levels of charitable giving, because such standards were set in order for companies in that industry to please their various stakeholder groups. So my invitation that I'm offering to you right now is to look for a counter-argument to the SMMO using this strategy. Pick an example that shows that the SMMO is either too stringent or too permissive, and then evaluate how a defender of the SMMO would handle that counterargument. Does the counterargument succeed, or does the counterargument fail?